How did we get here? In order to answer that question, we need to understand what here is and what that actually means. Here means today's environment where the vast majority of American people are living paycheck to paycheck. Here means a society structured in such a way that the richest 1% owns more wealth than the entire bottom 50% of the US. Here means we're in an environment where the vast majority of American people are 2 or 3 months away from being completely bankrupt. That is what we are talking about when we ask the question, how did we get here? And in order to answer that question, we need to go back to the 80s and understand three key figures that led us to where we are today. One is Ronald Reagan, two is Jack Welch, and three is Don Regan, who was part of the Reagan administration. So let's take a look at what happened during the Reagan administration that set the stage for where we are today. Now, I've mentioned before in previous episodes about how Republican economic and tax policy has led to a $50 trillion theft from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. That wealth transfer accounts for $600,000 in wealth that has been robbed and stolen from the bottom 90% to feed the 1%. And no matter what economic crisis happens, what do you notice? The 1% continues to get richer and richer. The foundation for all of that was set during the Nixon administration, and then it was accelerated during the Reagan administration. So, what were some of the things that happened during the Reagan administration that set the stage for this? One of the things that we have to understand is the role that Ronald Reagan and Don Regan played in convincing American CEOs to offshore a lot of their production and manufacturing capabilities overseas. And that was a tough conversation to have, but eventually American CEOs understood the big picture and understood what that offshoring of manufacturing capability as well as offshoring of jobs would mean to their bottom lines and their compensation packages. Before the Nixon era and before the Reagan era, you saw the greatest period of economic growth for most Americans happen in the post World War II era. Now, even considering how many people were left out of participating in that growth, it still represents by the numbers a great period of economic expansion. And that period of economic expansion was built on a bottom up, middle out strategy, meaning that the wealthiest of those in America would have to pay their fair share. And by strengthening unions, strengthening labor, and strengthening the working class, everybody would get ahead. And that proved to be the case. That all changed when Reagan took over. Reagan actually changed the criteria, and his conversations, and along with Don Regan's conversation, who was the Treasury Secretary under Reagan, their conversations with CEOs boiled down to freeing the American economy from regulation. And the actual policy involved dismantling everything and anything that would be structured to help the middle class. So, what did that actually mean in terms of practice? One of the conversations that happened was that during the Reagan administration, there was a meeting with the administration and some of the leading CEOs of the time. And the conversation that was had during that time was shrinking the manufacturing footprint and the power of labor in the US. And one of the suggestions that was given during the time was to ship manufacturing capabilities overseas or across borders to take advantage of a couple of different things. First and foremost, it would be labor, and second would be regulatory advantages that could be tapped into. Now, this was a tough conversation to have with CEOs because of the upfront costs that would be incurred by shipping all of these factory and manufacturing capabilities overseas. But the conversation that was had to overcome that was that, yes, there is an upfront cost, but once those factories are built, over the long run, you're going to recognize a lot more gains from that effort. And that started the slow trickle of manufacturing decline from the Reagan era going forward. When we look at how manufacturing has been transformed pre Reagan to today, It paints a stark picture. Prior to the Reagan era, American manufacturing led the world. And now, while it's still a leading manufacturer in global terms, the share of that manufacturing capability has gone in the tank. And this was all part of a broader strategy to shift the economy from a manufacturing economy to a services economy. And one of the things that you have to understand when you shift that manufacturing capability overseas, you greatly dilute the power of skilled trades in the middle class, which was the backbone of American society up until that point. And now we are faced with an economy that's increasingly made up of service sector employees. And those employees have less bargaining power, lower wages, and lower standards of living than those who are in the manufacturing space and skilled trades. This is why today we're seeing an environment where it's no longer reasonable for a blue collar worker to easily build a comfortable life for themselves. And that actually extends in the white collar world as well. When you think about some of the economic impacts of this transition, one of the easiest parallels to draw is how in the 80s, a $20 bill would be enough for you to go to the movies, get tickets for a family of four, have soda and popcorn, all with a $20 bill. And when you look at today, what does that $20 bill get you at the movies? It gets you one ticket and maybe a snack. That's a great example of how much more difficult it is today to make ends meet than it was in the 80s. In fact, when you look at the purchasing power of the dollar in the 80s compared to today, a person making $28,000 in the 80s was considered in the top 10% of society of that day. And to have that same standard of living today, that same person would need to make upwards of $150,000 a year to have the same standard of living. That gives you a picture of the impact of the Reagan administration and especially his forced obsolescence of the manufacturing sector, thanks to policies that he and Don Regan put together as an effort to deregulate American society. But those two aren't the only people that are responsible for getting us to where we are today. The other person that we have to look at is Jack Welch. Jack Welch is often propped up as a great business leader. He was the one that took GE to the next level. But when you look inside what actually happened during his leadership under GE, what was he in charge of? He put in one of the most toxic work cultures that you can think of. We are in an up or out culture that has its origins to Jack Welch. He basically put in structures and practices in place where every year, regardless of your previous year's performance, if you're in the bottom 10% of your company, you are managed out. And on top of that, Jack Welch's philosophies drove other CEOs and acolytes of his philosophy to look at constantly putting downward pressure on labor, on compensation, on benefits, making it harder and harder for the average worker to make ends meet. And you pair that with the constant offshoring that you saw in the late 80s and through the 90s and the early 2000s, that indicates to you how the value of the American worker has been crushed under Republican policies and Republican aligned business policies. What you see today in terms of the world of work and how difficult it is for the average worker to make ends meet is a clear outcome of the policies that were put into place from the Reagan era and carried forward by every Republican administration going forward. And it's only going to get worse because what you have in office today in the Trump administration are a collection of billionaires who have openly said that the American worker makes too much money. And that's why you see the attacks on the federal government, the regulatory state, all of the things that are designed to keep the average worker and the average person safe against the predatory interests of big business. That's why all of those things are getting taken away because it is in the interest of this administration. It is in the interest of Republicans to do whatever they can to create a two-class society. At the top of the heap are ultra wealthy billionaire whites, and then everybody else underneath them that forms the working class. There is no middle class in this utopia that the billionaire class wants to create. And that's why they're being deliberate in trying to extract every bit of wealth away from the bottom 90% so that they can actually own all of the resources while we get pushed further and further behind. So when you think about how did we get here and why is it so difficult to make ends meet? It's not because of the immigrant. It's not because of the Black person. It's not because of the Indian. It's not because of the LGBTQIA community. Plain and simple, the reason we are where we are is because of a 50-year con job that has been run on the American people by the smoke and mirrors of the Republican tax and economic policy.